When the Wrights' proposal was rejected with a form letter from the War Department, they were dumbfounded.
They took the world in a very literal sort of way, and they said they felt that if they had said that they had solved the problem and they had an aircraft that could do what they said they could do, that people should believe them.
Insulted by their own government's response, the brothers turned to Europe.
In Europe, the international situation was extremely tense. Germany and France were on the verge of war, and they had every reason to believe that the French or the Germans, or possibly the English, would be interested in buying their invention.
Wilbur and Orville were asking for $200,000 for their airplane. European government officials were reluctant to pay so much for a machine they couldn't see, especially when their own aviators were finally getting off the ground. In 1906, Alberto Santos Dumont, debonair aristocrat and celebrated balloonist, made the first powered flight in Europe before a crowd of Parisians.
When the plane left the ground, people just gasped. It was a moment of miracle, as one journalist put it. On the other hand, the Dumont plane was nothing like the Wright brothers' plane. It could fly in a straight line and had very minimal control. It was a very hazardous machine.
Though it was an uncontrolled hop of only 200 feet, Santos Dumont was proclaimed the father of aviation. Still refusing to show their airplane, Wilbur and Orville were about to lose all credit for their achievement. Chanute urged them to reconsider their sales strategy, but the brothers would not budge, even after they got their patent in 1906. Doubts about the Wright brothers' credibility turned to scorn. One French newspaper put it, "It is difficult to fly. It is easy for the Wrights to say, 'We have flown.' They are either flyers or liars." In 1907, Wilbur traveled to Europe to try to move the negotiations along. For a young man from Dayton, Ohio, Paris was a revelation. "Father, it is a curious custom here to have little tables at which crowds of people sit and sip wine and eat light lunches in the open air." "Orv, this afternoon I spent a couple of hours in the Louvre. I liked Leonardo da Vinci's John the Baptist much better than his Mona Lisa. Seems incredible that the Louvre was erected merely for a king's pleasure." The Wrights had hired an international sales agency, and its representative, Hartberg, showed Wilbur around Paris and came to have a lot of respect for him. "Catherine, when I first came over, Berg thought that he was the businessman and I was merely a sort of exhibit. Now he realizes that I see into situations deeper than they do, that my judgment is more often sound." Orville joined Wilbur in Paris several weeks later. As usual, their father, the bishop, was keeping a close watch. "Sons, be men of the highest types, personally, mentally, morally, and spiritually. Be clean, temperate, sober-minded, and great-souled. Father, all the wine I have tasted since leaving home would not fill a single wine glass. I am sure that Orville and myself will do nothing which will disgrace the training we received from you and Mother." Despite their efforts, negotiations with the French government floundered, and the brothers returned home empty-handed. Meanwhile, French aviators continued to make news. In January 1908, a young pilot named Henri Farman flew a kilometer in a closed circle. He had only marginal control and basically skidded through his turns, but he was turning. Now the French were more convinced than ever. They had conquered the air.
It must have been really frustrating for the Wrights. They had invented a real flying machine. They'd solved all the thorny technical problems. They'd done serious empirical and scientific research, built their machine, flown it, and yet the headlines were just filled with praise for these Europeans.
Finally, after 3 years of negotiations, the Wrights' claims reached President Theodore Roosevelt. Early in 1908, a deal was made with the U.S. Army Signal Corps for $25,000. Another deal with a French syndicate soon followed. Having built a second flyer, the brothers set out to prove that their machines could fly. Wilbur left for France, while Orville prepared for demonstrations in Washington.
It was the first time in a long time that they'd been separated on an important occasion, and they did feel the strain. And the strains were real. I mean, Wilbur was under a lot of pressure.
Orv, you can scarcely imagine what a strain it is on one to have no one to understand what you say, and no one capable of doing the grade of work we've always insisted upon. It compels me to do almost everything myself and keeps me worried.
Wilbur Wright was not a man who would allow himself to be rushed. He had painstakingly assembled the flyer. He took it to a small racetrack outside of the French town of Le Mans. A crowd had assembled on August 8, 1908. They waited, and they waited, and they waited in their starchy clothes, and finally Wilbur Wright appeared. Dressed appropriately in a business suit and a strange hat, green hat. He sat down in the flyer, whistling a tune that nobody could identify between his teeth and his tightly pursed lips. And he suddenly said, "Gentlemen, I am going to fly." A weight was dropped and the Wright flyer left the ground. At that moment, the 60-some-odd spectators rose to their feet in a spontaneous acclamation.
Wilbur's version of the day's events was slightly more understated. "I thought it would be good to do a little something," he wrote to Orville.
There was not one person who was present at that flight on the 8th of August of 1908 who did not realize that the Wright brothers had done everything that they said they had done, and that they were now far beyond the French. And in fact, one of them said at that time, and was quoted in the papers widely, "We are beaten."
Overnight, Wilbur became a sensation in France. "Catherine, I am in receipt of bouquets, baskets of fruit, flowers almost without number. The furor has been so great I cannot even take a bath without having 100 or 2 people peeking at me." The Wilbur Wright cap appeared in stores throughout Paris. 1 year after he was awed by the Louvre, it was reported that his frying pan would be put on display there.
The French felt it necessary to somehow jazz up Wilbur's character. For example, when they place him with a cigarette in his mouth next to a garish-looking woman, this a man who was seldom seen in the company of women other than his sister and who never smoked in his life.